In a seemingly routine flight from Los Angeles to New York, flight attendant Janet Palmer never expected that one encounter would spiral into a shocking confrontation that would alter the course of her career. Rachel Williams, a powerful, confident businesswoman, steps into the first-class cabin, exuding wealth and success. But as Janet's eyes linger, a strange discomfort stirs within her, a subtle doubt that Rachel truly belongs in this elite space. What begins as a quiet moment of judgment soon ignites a chain of events, forcing both women to confront their assumptions in the most dramatic way. Watch the drama unfold, and comment below, where are you watching from? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on this story. Janet Palmer, a flight attendant at Skyline Airlines, was preparing for a routine flight from Los Angeles to New York. The first-class cabin had filled up, and the passengers were settling into their seats. Janet was about to do a quick walk down the aisle when she noticed a new passenger approaching the boarding gate. A tall, confident woman, dressed in an impeccable designer suit, stepped up to the counter. This woman, Rachel Williams, exuded an aura of elegance and success as she smiled at the gate attendant and prepared to board. Janet's eyes briefly scanned Rachel's attire, a sleek, high-end outfit paired with expensive accessories. At first glance, she looked every bit the part of someone who belonged in first class. But as Rachel stepped forward, something about her presence made Janet pause. It wasn't her clothes or her demeanor, no, it was something deeper. Janet hadn't yet processed what she was feeling, but an instinctive discomfort lingered in the back of her mind. When Rachel reached the entrance to the cabin, Janet greeted her with a friendly smile, but there was an undercurrent of doubt in her tone. She nodded toward the first-class aisle as she spoke, but as Rachel passed by, Janet's gaze lingered for a moment longer than was necessary. This was the first of many moments that would spark a growing tension on the plane. Unbeknownst to Rachel, Janet had already passed her judgment. The subtle shift in her expression, which had appeared as a smile to Rachel, was anything but welcoming. It was the beginning of a quiet but charged interaction that would escalate in ways neither Janet nor Rachel could have anticipated. This wasn't just about a flight, it was about assumptions, about perceptions that would challenge both of them in ways they hadn't prepared for. As Rachel continued down the aisle to her seat, Janet's mind started to wander. The other passengers in the cabin hadn't noticed anything yet, but Janet felt an unspoken hesitation building up inside her. She wasn't aware that her actions were rooted in something deeper, a pattern of judgment that had been formed over years of interactions in the airline industry. It wasn't uncommon for Janet to see people in first class who didn't seem to match the usual profile of wealthy business travelers or elite customers. But today, as Rachel stepped into the cabin, Janet's mind whispered an unsettling question: did she truly belong in first class? This brief moment of internal doubt would become the starting point for a confrontation that would unfold later in the flight. For Janet, it was an unconscious bias creeping into her thoughts, one that would surface again when she interacted directly with Rachel. She didn't yet realize how the situation would unravel, but it had already begun, a delicate dance of assumptions, judgments, and misunderstandings that would have significant consequences for both women. Rachel Williams walked confidently toward the boarding gate at LAX, her head held high, embodying the poise and professionalism that had propelled her career in finance. As the CEO of a successful investment firm, she was used to the spotlight and the scrutiny that came with it. She had earned her place among the business elite, having worked tirelessly to build a name for herself in a male-dominated industry. Today, however, she wasn't thinking about work. This flight was a break from her demanding schedule, a rare opportunity to escape the constant pressures of the corporate world. Dressed in a tailored, navy blue suit and elegant heels, Rachel looked every bit the part of a businesswoman who belonged in first class. She had flown countless times for both business and pleasure, always choosing the comfort and quiet of first class to work or relax during her travels. But there was something different about this flight. Today, as she approached the gate, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. There was an edge to the atmosphere around her, a subtle undercurrent of judgment that she hadn't expected. As she presented her boarding pass and made her way to the first-class cabin, Rachel's mind briefly wandered to the strange encounter she had just had with a fellow passenger in the airport lounge. The other passenger had given her a once-over, as though sizing her up, and she had instinctively brushed it off. But now, walking down the aisle toward her seat, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was just a momentary lapse in her confidence. Still, she couldn't fully push the nagging thought that perhaps she didn't quite fit in, perhaps she didn't belong here. As Rachel neared her seat in first class, she noticed the flight attendants moving with practiced efficiency, preparing the cabin for the departure. Janet, who was stationed near the front of the cabin, glanced at her briefly. For a moment, their eyes met. Janet's polite smile was nothing more than a flicker of professionalism, and yet Rachel could detect something else. It wasn't overt, but there was a subtle judgment behind the smile. Rachel brushed it off as paranoia, but a small seed of discomfort had been planted. It wasn't the first time she had felt out of place in a setting where she should have felt comfortable. As a black woman who had risen through the ranks of the business world, Rachel was all too familiar with the ways people often underestimated her or questioned her presence in certain spaces. Whether it was in boardrooms, upscale restaurants, or on a plane like this one, she had faced that quiet skepticism before. But she had learned to rise above it, to stay confident in who she was and what she had accomplished. Rachel settled into her first-class seat, adjusting her bag and laptop as she prepared for the flight. She looked out the window, trying to push the uneasy feeling from her mind. She had worked hard to get here, to earn every ounce of success she had, and she wouldn't let anyone or anything make her feel small. Today was about reclaiming some peace in the midst of a hectic schedule. But as the plane slowly began to taxi toward the runway, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that her journey was about to take an unexpected turn. As Rachel settled into her first-class seat, she tried to push the unsettling feelings from her mind. She opened her laptop, briefly checking emails for work, hoping that the mundane task would provide a distraction. However, the discomfort lingering from the moment she first boarded the plane only grew. It wasn't long before Janet, the flight attendant, approached her with a clipboard in hand. "Excuse me, ma'am," Janet said, her voice clipped and formal, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "I just need to check your boarding pass again." Rachel paused, a slight frown forming on her face. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone firm, though she tried to keep her voice steady. Janet had already checked her boarding pass when she first boarded, so the request seemed unnecessary. "Oh, no, not at all," Janet replied, though her voice carried an undercurrent of something more. "It's just part of the routine. I'm sure it's nothing, but we need to verify that everything's in order." Janet's gaze flicked briefly to the row of seats behind Rachel, then back to her boarding pass. Rachel felt the shift in the air, the tension was unmistakable. Rachel gave Janet a polite but questioning look, wondering if this was some sort of misunderstanding. But Janet's lingering gaze felt uncomfortable, as if she were inspecting Rachel more than necessary. There was an air of condescension that Rachel couldn't ignore. It wasn't the professional demeanor she expected from someone in Janet's position, it felt like something else was at play. Janet finally nodded, and Rachel assumed she would leave. But instead, the flight attendant stood there for a few moments too long, her eyes moving back to the manifest in her hands. "Is there something wrong?" Rachel asked again, trying to keep her composure, her patience fraying slightly. "No, of course not," Janet replied too quickly. "I just wanted to make sure everything's aligned with the seating chart." Rachel's brow furrowed as Janet slowly walked away, her attention still clearly fixed on Rachel. It felt like a quiet but pointed challenge, one that Rachel couldn't ignore. Her intuition told her something wasn't right. Why would Janet insist on checking her pass again? Had there been an issue with her ticket, or was there something deeper at play? Rachel's fingers tightened around the edge of her laptop as she tried to shake off the feeling of being scrutinized. She wasn't sure if it was a lingering effect of her own insecurities or if Janet's actions were indeed as odd as they felt. Rachel glanced around the cabin, trying to sense whether anyone else noticed the interaction. Most of the other passengers seemed absorbed in their own activities, reading, scrolling through their phones, or adjusting their seats. Yet, she caught sight of a few who had glanced up from their magazines or devices when Janet had spoken to her. They quickly looked away, but the brief moment of attention felt uncomfortable to Rachel, as though the very act of her being here, in this seat, was drawing unwanted focus. As the seconds ticked by, Rachel's thoughts began to circle. She had earned her place in first class, as had everyone else seated there, but she couldn't help but feel an underlying tension. Why did Janet's actions feel so much more significant than just a random check? She had traveled extensively for business, and this was the first time she felt like an outsider in a space that was supposed to be a reprieve from the constant demands of her job. For a brief moment, Rachel questioned whether she was overthinking things, paranoid, perhaps, but then, the uncomfortable weight of the situation only grew stronger. She could feel it in the air, the judgment, the assessment. As Rachel tried to shake off her unease, she heard a low murmur from the passenger seated behind her. The soft voice, though unintentional, reached her ears, and she turned slightly to catch the tail end of a whispered conversation. One of the men had said, "You know, they're not all supposed to be in first class, right?" His words, though subtle, seemed to resonate more loudly than they should have. Rachel's stomach turned at the realization that she had just been the subject of that comment. Her face burned, and she quickly faced forward again, trying to push the sting of it aside. This wasn't just about an innocent seat assignment. It was about something much deeper, a bias, perhaps a subconscious judgment of her being in a space where, in some people's eyes, she didn't belong. Rachel had spent her whole life fighting for recognition, overcoming obstacles in her path. Whether those obstacles were related to her gender, race, or her rise in a competitive industry. Yet now, in this very moment, she felt like she was being reduced to nothing more than the stereotypes people tried to impose on her. Despite her frustration, Rachel decided to remain composed. She wasn't going to let the actions of a single flight attendant ruin her journey. She had worked too hard to achieve what she had, and if anything, this moment was a reminder that she would not let the judgment of others dictate her place in the world. She sat up straighter, refocused on her laptop, and tried to lose herself in work. The plane took off, and the rhythmic hum of the engine settled into the background as she allowed herself to relax slightly. But the atmosphere in the cabin felt different, heavier somehow. Rachel's mind raced with the possibility that Janet's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It had felt so personal, and now that the initial shock had faded, Rachel was starting to see the pattern. What if this wasn't just a random check-in? What if this was part of something more? As Rachel sat in her seat, still trying to distract herself with work, she noticed Janet walking up and down the aisles once again. She moved past Rachel several times, and each time, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that Janet was intentionally lingering a little longer than necessary. It wasn't overt, but it was enough to make Rachel's discomfort grow. She wasn't sure if Janet was intentionally singling her out, but there was something unmistakable in the way she kept returning to Rachel's seat, checking her status again and again. Rachel noticed a few more subtle actions that compounded her discomfort. For example, when she attempted to ask a simple question about a menu item, Janet's response was colder than it needed to be, with an unnecessary pause before answering. Her demeanor felt distant, almost dismissive. "Would you like something to drink, ma'am?" Janet asked, her voice lacking the usual friendliness of a flight attendant offering first-class service. Rachel caught a faint flicker in Janet's eyes, an unreadable expression that seemed to reflect more judgment than hospitality. "Just some water, please," Rachel replied, trying her best to maintain the composure she was known for. Janet nodded curtly and walked off without offering the customary pleasantries. It was such a small detail, but it felt like the final straw in an ongoing series of uncomfortable moments. By now, the rest of the passengers were beginning to sense something was off. A few of them exchanged looks when Janet had paused by Rachel's seat yet again, and the tension continued to build. Rachel, still calm on the surface, was beginning to feel the weight of every second. It wasn't just about the subtle dismissals or the questioning of her presence in first class, it was about the quiet, insidious way people like Janet believed they could make others feel small or unwelcome. These moments, though fleeting, added up to something much larger, an experience Rachel had navigated many times before in her life, but that still stung, even now. As the plane cruised toward its destination, the air between Rachel and Janet became thick with unsaid words. Rachel wondered if this was the beginning of a battle she didn't want to fight, one that involved questioning her place in a world that was supposed to welcome her as an equal. But Rachel had already made up her mind. She would confront whatever was coming head-on. She had worked too hard to let this moment define her, and if she was being unfairly judged, she would stand up for herself. No matter what the world threw her way, Rachel would rise above it. As Rachel tried to settle into the quiet rhythm of the flight, her focus returned to the laptop in front of her, determined to complete some work. However, the feeling of unease never left her. It was almost as if there was a subtle force in the air pushing against her, making her feel out of place. It wasn't the airplane or the flight that unsettled her, it was the tension in the cabin, and the ongoing scrutiny from Jessica, the flight attendant. When Rachel finally allowed herself to relax a little, the flight attendant reappeared, walking briskly down the aisle with purpose. Jessica's presence felt more pointed this time, her movements almost deliberate as she passed Rachel's seat. Rachel felt her pulse quicken, though she wasn't sure why. She had told herself that it was nothing more than a series of misunderstandings, perhaps some minor discomfort she was overthinking. But something told her this wouldn't just go away. "Excuse me, ma'am," Jessica said as she stopped next to Rachel's seat. "I'll need to check your boarding pass again." Rachel blinked, taken aback. "Didn't we just go through this?" she asked, her voice a little sharper than she intended. "I'm in my assigned seat." Jessica didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked down at the boarding pass she was holding and seemed to scrutinize it with undue care. Rachel could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, the eyes of other passengers in the cabin focused on this strange interaction. She wasn't used to feeling so exposed, so vulnerable. The passengers around her didn't even try to hide their interest. A few exchanged subtle glances, the discomfort palpable. "I'm sure it's nothing," Jessica finally said, though her voice had a barely perceptible tremor that made it feel anything but dismissive. "Just routine, ma'am." Rachel's grip on her armrest tightened. There was nothing routine about this. Jessica had checked her boarding pass before they even boarded the plane. And yet, here she was again, seemingly determined to put Rachel under the microscope. It was a move that wasn't lost on her, and Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a mix-up. It was intentional. The other passengers, who had been quiet up until this point, were now beginning to murmur among themselves. Rachel didn't need to see their faces to know what was happening. The air around her was thick with judgment, and it felt like the whole plane was watching her. This was more than a flight, it was a performance, and she was the subject of it. "I'm sorry," Rachel said, her patience starting to wear thin. "But I don't appreciate being treated like this." Jessica's lips tightened, but she didn't respond immediately. There was an uncomfortable silence that settled over the cabin, and Rachel could feel the tension building. She wasn't just a woman sitting in her seat, she was a target, an anomaly in a world where she wasn't supposed to belong. Jessica's behavior, which at first seemed like a mistake, now felt like something much more deliberate, a statement of exclusion. Before Rachel could say anything else, Jessica walked away, but not before offering her an almost apologetic smile. The smile, though, didn't reach her eyes. It was a performative gesture, one that only intensified the discomfort Rachel felt. The moment Jessica passed, Rachel looked around at the other passengers, their faces a mix of curiosity and discomfort. She had become a spectacle, and she hated every second of it. She turned back toward the window, trying to focus on the view outside, but the distant skyline offered little solace. The distant hum of the plane, usually soothing, now felt like a cacophony in her ears. She felt isolated, alienated, and exposed in a way she never had before. It wasn't just about the flight, it was about the subtle racism she had faced countless times in her life, disguised in the form of microaggressions, stares, and assumptions that she didn't belong. Today, it felt like she was reliving all of those moments at once, compressed into a few minutes of intense discomfort. Jessica's behavior wasn't just an isolated incident, it was part of a broader pattern, one that Rachel had learned to navigate her entire life. But today, it wasn't something she could ignore. She had faced prejudice before, in boardrooms and airports, in elevators and at conferences. She had always risen above it, confident in her abilities and her success. But now, something about this interaction felt different. Something about Jessica's presence seemed to challenge Rachel's right to be in this space. It wasn't just about the seat, it was about the very idea of her being there at all. And that thought gnawed at Rachel as the minutes ticked by, the tension in the air thickening with each passing second. The flight moved on, but the tension didn't dissipate. Rachel found herself thinking about the encounter with Jessica over and over again. She had always prided herself on being able to rise above challenges, to maintain composure in the face of adversity. But this was different. This wasn't just a random, impersonal interaction. It had been personal. And it was clear to Rachel now that Jessica had been questioning her presence on this flight from the very beginning. As the flight continued, Rachel's thoughts turned back to the way people viewed her, how they saw her not as a successful businesswoman, but as something else. Someone who didn't belong. The thought was disheartening, but Rachel couldn't help but acknowledge it. The truth was that her success had never shielded her from prejudice. She had faced it in every step of her journey, whether it was as a young professional in the corporate world or now, in this small, confined space on the plane. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was the reality she lived with every day. She didn't know why she hadn't spoken up earlier. Maybe she had been too polite, too composed. But now, as she sat there, staring ahead at the cabin wall, she realized that this moment was about more than just herself. It was about standing up for the countless people who had been silenced, the ones who had been made to feel like outsiders in places they had every right to occupy. This wasn't just her fight, it was a fight for everyone who had ever been marginalized, made to feel less than, simply because of their identity. Rachel had come so far in life, achieving things that most people only dreamed of. She had worked tirelessly to break barriers, to push beyond the limits others had set for her. And yet, in this moment, she was faced with the harsh reminder that no matter how much she accomplished, there would always be those who saw her as an anomaly, a curiosity, or worse, a threat. As the plane began its descent, Rachel's thoughts were interrupted by a quiet voice from the seat beside her. It was David Monroe, the man she had noticed earlier, who had given her a strange look when Jessica had approached. Rachel had assumed he was just another passenger who couldn't be bothered with the subtle dynamics of air travel, but now, as he leaned over to speak to her, she realized that he had been watching the entire exchange between her and Jessica. "Are you okay?" David asked, his voice low enough to avoid drawing attention but filled with genuine concern. Rachel blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected anyone to speak up, especially not someone who hadn't been directly involved in the confrontation. David wasn't trying to make a scene, but his intervention was enough to catch Rachel off guard. For a moment, she simply stared at him, unsure how to respond. "I'm fine," Rachel replied, her voice steady, but the weight of her emotions was starting to show. She quickly looked away, focusing on the window once more, as if she could escape the whole situation by disappearing into the city below. But David wasn't deterred. "You don't have to put up with that," he continued, his voice low but firm. "That wasn't right. What she did, it was unprofessional, and it shouldn't happen. I just wanted to make sure you knew that." Rachel nodded slowly, a sense of gratitude rising within her. She wasn't used to being defended like this, not in the open, not in front of so many strangers. It wasn't the sort of thing she had ever asked for, but in that moment, it felt like a small but significant victory. It felt like someone was finally acknowledging the subtle, unseen battles she fought every day, battles that no one else could see. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I appreciate it." David offered a small, sympathetic smile before retreating back into his own seat. The brief exchange, though seemingly insignificant, had a profound impact on Rachel. It reminded her that, even in the face of adversity, there were still allies, still people willing to stand up for what was right. And in that moment, Rachel realized that she wasn't alone in this fight. The plane began its descent into New York, and as Rachel gathered her belongings, she knew that this experience wouldn't end here. The encounter with Jessica was just the beginning. It was a sign that the fight for equality and respect was far from over. But it was a fight Rachel was prepared to face head-on. She had spent her life building a career, proving that she belonged, and she wouldn't stop now. No matter what challenges came her way, she would rise above them. As she prepared to disembark, Rachel took one last look around the cabin. The passengers who had been watching her earlier seemed to have lost interest, absorbed once again in their own worlds. But Rachel knew that things had changed. She had learned something important as the flight continued. Jessica Reed's internal discomfort grew. She had tried to push the incident with Rachel Williams to the back of her mind, focusing instead on her duties as a flight attendant, but it was impossible to ignore the growing sense of unease. Rachel hadn't been a typical passenger. Not in the way that most first-class passengers were, anyway. There was an air about her, a level of poise and confidence that Jessica couldn't quite place. Yet, what really struck Jessica was how her own behavior had unfolded in the past few hours. It was the small things, really, the way she had doubted Rachel's right to be seated in first class, the subtle hints of condescension that had slipped into her tone when questioning Rachel's boarding pass. And then there was the moment when she had insisted on checking Rachel's boarding pass again, even though she had already done so. It had all seemed so insignificant in the moment, just part of the routine, part of the job. But now, in the quiet moments after the flight took off, Jessica began to see the situation in a new light. She had been scrutinizing Rachel, not just as a passenger, but as an outsider, someone who didn't fit her preconceived notions of who belonged in first class. The more Jessica thought about it, the more she realized the depth of her own biases. They had been there, hidden beneath the surface, guiding her actions and fueling her discomfort. But now, those biases were no longer just a private thought, they were becoming actions that had consequences. And the more Jessica reflected on her behavior, the more she felt the sting of guilt creeping in. She had always prided herself on being a professional, on treating all passengers with respect and courtesy. But now, she could see how she had failed in that regard. How had she let herself act this way? How had she allowed her personal biases to overshadow her professional duties? Jessica glanced over at Rachel's seat, where the woman sat quietly, her expression unreadable. Rachel had been calm, composed even, throughout the entire exchange. She hadn't raised her voice or made a scene. She had simply sat there, dignified and unbothered. And yet, Jessica couldn't help but feel a twinge of embarrassment. She knew, deep down, that her actions had been uncalled for, that Rachel deserved better. She had been wrong, and the realization hit her harder than she expected. The flight continued without incident, but the weight of Jessica's actions was heavy on her shoulders. She wasn't sure what Rachel had thought of her or if she had even noticed the subtle shift in Jessica's behavior, but Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a misstep. The words of the passengers around her echoed in her mind, the judgment, the subtle hints that Rachel didn't belong there. She had been part of that conversation, whether she liked it or not, and now she couldn't escape the consequences. As the flight began to approach its destination, Jessica walked down the aisle, her thoughts still consumed by what had transpired. She couldn't help but glance over at Rachel once more, this time noticing how calm and collected the woman seemed. The contrast between them couldn't have been more apparent. Rachel had every reason to be frustrated, to challenge Jessica's authority or to make a scene, but instead, she had chosen to remain composed. And that realization only served to amplify Jessica's guilt. Jessica had seen how her actions had made Rachel feel, how the woman had felt the weight of her judgment, the discomfort of being questioned in a space she had every right to occupy. She had seen the discomfort in Rachel's eyes, the way she had held her ground without saying a word. And yet, Jessica hadn't realized the full extent of her behavior until now. She had been a part of something far larger than herself, something that wasn't just about a seat on a plane, but about the subtle biases that shaped the way people saw each other. Jessica couldn't deny it anymore. She had failed. She had made Rachel feel small, and for that, she felt ashamed. There was no excuse for what she had done, and no way to undo the damage. But one thing was clear. The moment she had treated Rachel differently because of her assumptions about who belonged in first class, she had crossed a line. As the plane touched down at its destination, Jessica's mind was heavy with regret. The realization of the consequences of her actions was still sinking in. She had allowed her own biases to guide her behavior, and now she would have to live with the fallout. The tension in the air was palpable as the plane taxied toward the gate. Jessica's mind was spinning with thoughts of what had transpired over the course of the flight. She couldn't escape the feeling of unease that had settled over her, and her guilt only deepened with every passing minute. She had been wrong, and she knew it. There was no denying that the events of the flight had taken a serious toll on her, but now, as the plane made its final approach, Jessica knew that she couldn't simply brush it off. The weight of the situation was too great. She had tried to keep herself busy, serving the passengers with the professionalism she prided herself on, but her mind kept returning to Rachel. She couldn't shake the memory of the uncomfortable exchange between them, the way she had treated Rachel, the way she had questioned her presence in first class. She felt like she had failed Rachel, failed herself, and failed the standards she had set for her work as a flight attendant. It wasn't just about the incident, it was about what it represented. She had let her own prejudices and assumptions dictate her actions, and now, she had to face the consequences. As the plane finally came to a stop at the gate, Jessica took a deep breath. She tried to gather her composure, but before she could even think about heading toward the galley, the captain's voice came over the intercom, addressing her directly. "Jessica, I need to speak with you in the cockpit," Captain Mark Davidson said, his voice firm but not unkind. Jessica's stomach sank. She had known this conversation was coming, but hearing it made it all too real. She had hoped, even briefly, that she could somehow avoid the fallout, that the whole situation would just blow over. But she knew better than that. She had been caught in a moment of unchecked bias, and now she had to answer for it. As she walked toward the cockpit, her mind raced. What would the captain say? What would happen next? She had always respected Captain Davidson. He was a man of integrity and experience, someone who had been in the industry for years. If anyone would see through the situation and understand, it would be him. But deep down, Jessica knew that she couldn't hide behind that respect anymore. The reality of what had happened, of how she had treated Rachel, was too significant to ignore. When she entered the cockpit, Captain Davidson was already seated, his face a mask of professionalism. He looked up at her as she stepped inside, his expression serious but not hostile. "Sit down, Jessica," he said, gesturing toward the chair next to him. Jessica hesitated for a moment before taking a seat. She didn't know what to expect, but the silence that stretched between them felt heavy. The hum of the airplane's systems was the only sound that filled the cockpit. Finally, Captain Davidson spoke. "I've been made aware of the situation with one of the passengers, Rachel Williams," he began, his voice measured. "I've seen the footage, and I've spoken with the flight crew. It's clear that there was a misunderstanding, but the fact remains that you acted inappropriately. Your behavior towards Rachel wasn't just unprofessional, it was discriminatory." Jessica's heart sank as the weight of his words hit her. She had been expecting some kind of reprimand, but hearing it from Captain Davidson, someone she respected, made it sting even more. "I didn't mean to," Jessica began, but her voice faltered. She knew that any defense she made would sound hollow. There was no excuse for her actions, and she knew it. I understand that you didn't intend for it to go the way it did, Captain Davidson continued, his tone softening slightly. But intent doesn't change the impact of your actions. You made Rachel feel uncomfortable and unwelcome in a place where she had every right to be. As a crew member, you're expected to uphold the highest standards of professionalism, and that includes treating every passenger with respect and dignity. Jessica swallowed hard. She had always prided herself on being a professional, on embodying the values of hospitality that Skyline Airlines stood for. But now, those values felt like a distant memory. The reality of what she had done, of how she had treated Rachel, was too overwhelming to ignore. "I'm sorry," Jessica said quietly. "I didn't realize the impact of my actions. I didn't mean to hurt her. She trailed off, unsure of what else to say. "I know you didn't mean to cause harm," Captain Davidson replied. "But the fact remains that you did. And now, we have to address it." The conversation that followed was long and difficult. Captain Davidson outlined the steps that would be taken to investigate the incident, including a formal review of Jessica's conduct. He also informed her that the airline would be conducting an internal investigation into her actions, which could result in disciplinary measures, including possible suspension or termination. Jessica felt a knot tighten in her stomach as the reality of the consequences set in. "I'll do whatever it takes to make things right," Jessica said, her voice filled with regret. She knew that her apology wouldn't erase what had happened, but she was willing to take responsibility for her actions. Captain Davidson nodded, his expression softening just slightly. "That's the first step, Jessica. Acknowledging the mistake is important. But it's going to take time to rebuild trust, both with Rachel and with the rest of the crew." Jessica nodded silently, understanding the gravity of the situation. She had made a mistake, one that could cost her career. But she knew that she had to face the consequences, no matter how painful they might be. The story of Rachel Williams and Janet Palmer on the flight highlights deep-rooted themes of bias, discrimination, and the human tendency to make assumptions about others based on appearance. At first glance, Rachel, a successful black CEO, seems to fit the mold of someone who belongs in first class, but Janet's discomfort and subtle judgment reveal the unconscious biases that can influence our behavior, even in professional settings. This interaction is not just about a seat on an airplane, it's a microcosm of the broader social dynamics at play in society, where people are often judged based on race, status, or appearance, regardless of their qualifications or achievements. The story challenges us to reflect on how we treat others, especially those who may appear different from the expected norms of a given space. Janet's initial discomfort with Rachel, though subtle, is a reminder of how easily we let assumptions shape our interactions. These biases, whether conscious or unconscious, have the power to diminish the dignity of others and create unnecessary tension in what should be neutral spaces. Rachel's response, on the other hand, is a testament to resilience. Despite the discomfort and subtle discrimination she faces, she maintains her composure and refuses to let others define her worth. Her confidence in herself, despite the circumstances, is a powerful message of self-empowerment, especially for those who, like her, face marginalization in different aspects of life. The story is also a call to action for us to not only recognize the biases that exist in our own lives but to challenge them actively. This encounter speaks to the importance of empathy and understanding in our everyday interactions. The discomfort Rachel felt was not just about a flight attendant's questioning of her seat assignment, it was about being treated as an outsider in a space where she had every right to belong. This scenario is one many people of color experience regularly, whether in the workplace, public spaces, or even within their own communities. In the end, the lesson lies in how we confront these biases, how we learn to engage with people beyond their outward appearances or perceived status. Whether it's standing up for someone who is being unfairly treated or taking the time to reflect on our own biases, each small action contributes to creating a more just and equitable world. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell for notifications. Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. Your input means a lot to us.